Okay. This video, I'm going to talk about what's wrong with capitalism. Specifically, what's wrong with modern capitalism to a modern investor in the United States of America today. I mean, it funnels it down pretty dramatically. Um, but what prompts this one? Okay. I follow a subreddit called Wall Street Bets. This showed up in the news 5 or 6 years ago, whatever it was, when the GameStop thing hit, and boy, was that a cluster. But I've been following it for years, and it's finance bros doing coke and taking big risks is basically the attitude, kind of the vibe of that group, at least in the old days. And it was made by a guy who just was like, I'm just betting money on stock options, and if I win, great. He's using it like a casino, like a lottery or whatever. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. No crying in the casino is the kind of their attitude. They just got this very gruff, very toxically masculine attitude, but it's all kind of actually, believe it or not, in good fun. It's like we're just all mean and rude and just smash mouth to each other, and it's kind of a fun vibe actually when you understand that aspect of it. It's not meant to be taken seriously, obviously, but one of the jokes, I'll try to use some delicate language about this one, is if you run out of money speculating wildly on the stock market, don't worry. There's always a job performing sexual services behind the dumpster out at Wendy's. Right? Is one of the running gag jokes of this place, and but ironically, okay, and I don't think this is accidental. I don't think any of this stuff is organic much anymore. In the wake of SpaceX and its IPO and the amount of money that was made by people who got in and bought stock for the first few days, as soon as options trading was enabled, suddenly the stock started performing terribly, and in a way that was very different than it had been the few days before. And those options were very, very expensive. You would have had to see a 5% gain at any price point worth talking about in order for you to actually break even, and then some. Okay, the likelihood of that happening, now while it is a very volatile stock, the likelihood of you actually achieving that profit that you're looking for is very minimal, and you might be lucky to double your money, is kind of how it is now. It's not to say that some people didn't make out well, but I would venture to say that a lot of money was made by people who wrote those stock options as soon as they were available last week. But or I guess it was 2 weeks ago. But earlier this week, a klaxon call went out for the health of the stock of Wendy's. Right now, there's some wild speculation on the listing for the restaurant Wendy's. Now, again, this is anecdotal. I can't remember the last time I ate at Wendy's, but I'm pretty certain it was not a great experience. And in fact, eating out in general, especially with fast food, has become, I don't know if it's because I just have become a little more flu in my tastes or whatever, but the food at Jack in the Box is not good. Okay, the food at McDonald's, awful. It's awful. And honestly, I think the only kind of fast food like sandwich that I actually kind of enjoy is anything that's like a breakfast sandwich that is a croissant with a fried egg and a slab of some sort of pork meat on it. That's kind of hard to screw up. Just butter and grease. If you can't cook an egg right, get out of the business, right? It's basically how it is. That's where you start in the cookbook, is eggs. But they're charging a ridiculous amount too. A lot of people, one of the things I noticed, especially post-COVID, is people talking about like, okay, I go to Jersey Mike's and spend $20 on a sub sandwich. $20. The people working behind the counter would have to work almost 3 hours probably in order to buy one of the sandwiches from that store, okay? And it's just a sandwich that's been wrapped up and thrown in a bag and given to you, you know? And you can get counter service. You can at least have a wait staff come and refill your drinks and stuff at a lot of places for that kind of money. So why would I go to Jersey Mike's? Why would I go to McDonald's? Last time I've went to Jack in the Box, because they're open at 2 a.m. That's their only real advantage. I spent probably $40 for a meal for 2 people. Come on, man, for what this food is. But nevertheless, the stock is suddenly starting to do real well. Even though the reality on the ground is Wendy's is in real trouble. They're $4 billion in debt. I think they've got $1 billion in market capitalization. They're having to do a bunch of refurbs to their restaurants because they're trying anything to bring people in besides lower prices and provide better quality food. But nevertheless, the stock is behaving erratically as if it's a stock that you truly don't know. You know, like, is it like a pharma stock or something, you know? Why is this happening? Why are so many people throwing so much money at something that really is a foolish investment, right? And the answer is pretty simple. Because wages don't make up enough of our incomes anymore. You have to earn $100,000 a year or more to be comfortable in most cities in the United States anymore, and maybe more. And when we say comfortable, we're talking about living in an apartment that is an appropriate size for you and your family, you know, in a decent neighborhood, and be able to have groceries, eat out once in a while, and maybe go on a little vacation once a year. Okay, we're not talking about living high on the hog. $100,000 does not mean what it used to anymore. Neither does $1 million. A starter home in most major American cities now is over $1 million. Last time I checked, $1 million divided by 20% would mean you'd have to earn about $200,000 to comfortably make a mortgage payment on that. That's not what people are earning, okay? So unless you actually happen to have a house when prices were somewhat more reasonable and have some capital to bring with you, you're not going to get a home. Not one of those homes anyway, you know? And so people are looking for ways to figure it out. They're getting desperate. And the behavior of the stock market and the predatory nature of what's happening to the stock market has a lot to do with it. Now, I grew up during what was called the Volcker era. Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, during the 80s. And in the wake of the inflation epidemic of the 1970s, which really had more to do with Richard Nixon debasing the value of the American dollar off of gold, because we probably didn't have it to give back to Europe in the first place. The value of the dollar really just became about the interest rates of treasury bonds, which is how how they're funded, and the strength of the American dollar, simply because we demand everyone trade oil for dollars, and we beat up countries that try not to do that, you know, i.e. Iraq, i.e. Russia, i.e. Iran, i.e. North Korea, i.e. any of those other countries that we label as an enemy. Take a look at how they're trying to trade for oil, and you'll figure out real fast why we think that way about them, okay? But politics aside, when Volcker came in, inflation was through the roof. And so he did the only thing at the time that the Federal Reserve seemed to have available to them to try to rein that in. Increased interest rates dramatically. Interest rate was over 10 or 11% for the Federal Reserve. What does that mean? So the Federal Reserve has the capacity to lend money overnight to its member banks, and they charge a certain percentage to those member banks for that privilege, and they can renew or give back the money every day. Now, 10% is an annualized number. They're not paying 10% every night. But what that does is it has a cascading effect to all financial products available to anyone in the country, because the Federal Reserve, being essentially because they're like the banking monopoly, they can just print as much as they want. They are the safest bank to borrow from, and every major bank that borrows for them are going to be the safest next to them in terms of their ability to not go belly up, although they do their best to try to break themselves, and on and so forth. Right now, every bank, of course, is going to want to charge interest. Is a function of risk as well as their profit. So a bank will charge you a wide variety of interest based on what it is that they're offering to you, based on the collateral and the creditworthiness of the borrower. And so, for example, a home loan is going to be much cheaper in terms of interest. That is when you own 20% of it and it's backed by a collateral asset versus an unsecured credit card to somebody who has poor credit, right? The interest rate is going to just be higher because the risk of default is higher and the risk of the bank eating it is higher, right? Whereas if at the very least, if you foreclose on your house, the bank can at least sell the house and get a bunch of its money back, right? Seems pretty straightforward. Interest rates were way different when I was a kid, okay? And that there were two aspects to that. One, when everybody talks about how the boomers bought their house for $70,000 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever, that was a different interest rate environment. If I bought a house, for example, we're just going to use simple numbers. If I bought a house for $100,000 in 1978 when I was born, and the interest rate was 10%, that means every year I'm paying $10,000 just in interest alone to service that loan, plus whatever principal I'm slowly paying down, okay? So it follows that if I tried to buy $1 million starter home, I'd have to pay $100,000 in interest every year at 10%. So I would have to fork that over every year in addition to whatever salary I would earn to cover my basic living expenses. It's just not going to happen for most people, right? So inversely, housing prices are a function of interest rates. And part of the struggle that we're seeing right now is that because interest rates were so low for so long, the price of housing started to go up. Nobody wants to lose money on their houses. A lot of people's net worths are tied up, a lot of it is tied up in their houses. So if the house value of housing goes down, people are going to suffer, right? They can't get out from under their mortgages. That happened to me in 2009. I was upside down considerably thanks to how badly the house market collapsed in 2009. And the banks would not work with me. They got plenty of money from the government to help them out. But when it came to refinancing or taking some weight off my shoulders in terms of how the house prices went, there was no help for you and me. That's one big thing that really irks me about what happened in 2009 and how they handled that, is that they didn't help the consumer. They could have helped the banks by helping the consumer. That would have had a trickle up effect. If we're going to talk about how great trickle down is, how about some trickle up? But instead, they just gave the money to the banks directly, and they made out like bandits. Bank of America almost went bankrupt. Washington Mutual did, but they got bailed out, and so they are stronger than ever and making a killing and dictating how we run our country again. And the people who actually really suffered from that, they got no help at all, right? But on the other side of that is savings, okay? Now, if the Federal Reserve is charging 10%, the bank would rather borrow money from you, okay? So if they aren't going to give you as much interest as the Federal Reserve charges them, but still you could, in those days, get a bank account with 7-8% interest. And that's pretty good money. You put $1,000 in, at the end of the year, you get $80, $70, $80. That's a pretty good return, okay? But I say this in light of the fact that I just got my statement back for my business savings account, which I've got about $6,000 in there right now, which is earmarked for payroll taxes at the end of the year. 4 cents I got this month. 4 pennies, which they're trying to get rid of now. On a $6,000 savings, which is investing in the bank. That's what you're doing when you put money in a bank account. Now, I don't put that money in there with interest bearing in mind. I'm basically earmarking it. But the reality is I'm losing money on that because inflation is eating away the buying power of that. The only thing that really makes me feel okay about that is that that's money that is calculated based on income, and that's going to go to the government one way or the other. Okay, I could be earning a little bit more on that money, but it would either lock it up or put it at risk, and I do not want to do that. Not for my payroll taxes. Okay, so 4 cents it is. But when I was a kid, they were telling us you could make this money by putting money in a savings account. That is an anachronism that has been dead for 20 or 30 years. And until interest rates come up considerably, savings accounts are not going to be attractive. Now, I've seen a few products where they're like, hey, look, 3-4%, and other stuff where it's really speculative, but they're trying to advertise it like it's a savings account. Oh, you're going to get fleeced. When they start pitching you products that are like, oh, it's better than a savings account. Don't do that. Don't do that. That money is not going to be there when you need it. And that's the thing, is the reason why you have a market collapse is because everybody needs their money at the same time. And they're all going for their money at the same time. And all the assets that are backing that stuff have to be sold at a discount in order to retrieve that money. And so you take a hit, right? So what happened? Well, as I mentioned, in the wake of the 90s, okay, after Paul Volcker's experiment went well, I would say, Alan Greenspan took over and he started pumping the housing market, lowering interest rates, buy a house. And that worked out for a little while. We also had a lot of speculation because money was cheap and the internet was a new thing and everybody was going to make a gajillion dollars off of their new catalog that was available on the World Wide Web and all that other stuff. Well, and this has been 25 years. I can't believe it's been this long. But suffice it to say, sooner or later, someone was like, how are we going to make money at this? And when that watershed moment happened and everybody started thinking about the same thing, all of a sudden the market collapsed because now they're like, wow, I don't want to keep throwing good money after bad. And I can tell you that was the right thing to do. I was delivering audiovisual equipment as a delivery guy, basically, like a technical delivery guy that hit a lot of .com type firms. And I remember one in particular where they had this amazing office, beautiful office, very art on the walls and all that stuff. They were drinking Dom Perignon in the middle of the day on a Thursday. It's not going to go well for that company. Let's put it that way. They were partying off of on a daily basis off of profits that they never realized. I don't even remember what the name of the company was, but there were so many of them in Seattle. For every Amazon.com, there was a Pets.com and a Hardware.com and a this.com and a that.com that all went under because they didn't actually figure out how are we going to make money at this. They just wanted to be first to market. We're seeing the same behavior now, by the way, with AI, but that's another story. But part of the reason that happened is because interest rates were low enough that it encouraged that kind of speculation because people are looking for a return on their money and savings was not going to do it anymore. So, of course, the market collapses. And why interest rates? Let's talk about that, okay? So one of the missions, in fact, the core mission of the Federal Reserve is to maintain optimal employment. You will note that the word is not maximum employment, not full employment, optimal. Because the Federal Reserve believes that the balance between inflation and unemployment is completely interrelated, and therefore you want to have a certain level of unemployment in order to keep inflation down. This is what Jerome Powell meant when he talked about disciplining the labor market back in 2021, just before they started jacking things around and everything went south for everyone for the past few years, okay? Because labor was able to demand more money, the cost of things were going up, mainly because the cost of labor was going up. And so the cost of everything was going up. Inflation was high. We need to increase interest rates to combat the lower level of unemployment so that we can have things stop costing so much. They only seem to really care about inflation when it comes to labor, though. They don't think about inflation when it comes to right now. They probably should increase interest rates significantly in order to combat what's happening, but they don't want to do it. Anyway, so in the wake of the dot-com boom, they had a bunch of cheap interest rates. Well, what happened? Speculation in the housing market. Okay, lots of people started buying houses because they're a pretty safe investment. And not only that, because interest rates were so low, people could buy more houses. They were reducing lending restrictions on people, lowering credit requirements, all that other stuff. And so people could buy more house than they could afford, and the cost of housing went up significantly heading into 2008, 2009. I watched as I was coming of age. I had a young child, and I was like, I want to buy a house. I want to buy a 3-bedroom house, and I felt like I was chasing a runaway train, trying to make enough money just for the down payment. I managed to squeeze in, and I bought that house for $400,000, a three-bedroom house in the exurbs. I don't even want to call them the suburbs. It was the exurbs of Seattle. And it was built in like 1982 and all these other things, almost $500,000. And I felt like, man, this is way too expensive, but it was the price of housing. And so I got in and I felt like, all right, well, at least I have a house now for my family. And 6 months later, it was appraised at $480,000. And it kept going up. It kept going up to, I think, 525 is what it finally, like Zillow or somebody measured it at. And then the housing market collapsed because of overspeculation. Well, the value of my house went down a third, and that meant two things. One, all these the interest rates, when they lowered the interest rates to increase the money supply, to encourage borrowing, to encourage, fluidity and liquidity in the market, those interest rates came down, and it meant that I could make a fairly lower mortgage payment if I could refinance. But they wouldn't let me refinance. They wouldn't let most of us refinance. The only people they let refinance were people who were defaulting on their loans. They could make short sales, or they might give them some sort of deal that would allow them some break on the interest that they were being charged without any adjustment to the principal. Okay, that's not how it worked out for the banks, of course. And if they really wanted to save the economy, they could have helped homeowners out considerably, and that would have had a trickle-up effect. But that's not how the government works. And I'm still salty about how they dealt with things in 2009. They just made things worse, and we're in this situation we're in because they didn't actually fix the problem. They just papered over it to make sure that their friends on Wall Street were glad-handled. But anyway, in the wake of 2009 almost brought the world to its knees. We were almost facing another Great Depression, is what we were looking at there. But they printed a bunch of money. They gave a bunch of loans to the banks and lowered interest rates to next to nothing for years. And that kind of stabilized things. At least it stopped the bleeding during the first Obama administration. We kind of limped our way along through the second. So the savings vehicle for us stopped being a savings account and certificates of deposit, and they started to become the stock market and housing. Okay, now the stock market in particular, what started to happen in the 80s and 90s was Jack Welch's philosophy entered the business world, and they were like, cut costs at all costs, cut all workers at all costs, don't worry about the obligations you signed up for, and you know what, it's okay to default, is basically what business got out of Jack Welch. Despite what you might think, I don't think he was a good influence on business in this country. But part of what happened was a lot of companies filed for bankruptcy or filed for Chapters 11 or whatever to restructure themselves. And part of that restructuring was to bail on their pension obligations. My grandfather, who worked for 35 years for Boeing, cut a portion of his check aside to have a pension. And he got that pension when he retired because Boeing was a solid firm. It paramilitary, all that other stuff. It's a safe place, more or less, people thought, to put money into it. Same with GM. A lot of people had pensions with GM. Well, guess what GM did, man? They bailed on their pension obligations to a lot of workers, and suddenly people were left where they thought they had a retirement, and now they don't. Well, government, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, but government ended up picking up the tab sometimes on that. So there was that, but the pensions that were promised and saved for those people by the companies that they work for ended up being a taxpayer burden. And what came of a lot of that was the 401k. Now, the 401k and the IRA and all these other retirement vehicles, they came as an alternative to people who either didn't have access to a pension or didn't want to gamble only on one company and wanted to be able to have a brokerage or savings account of some sort that was advantaged, tax advantaged, that they could use to save for retirement. Again, this seems like a good idea, okay? It's just basically another bank account or brokerage account that has its own special tax sheltered status, but it's meant for you to save, okay? Great. But what happened there? Well, the 401k, the first thing that happened was they put in a lot of restrictions on what the regulations were and what companies could actually offer 401ks and what qualified for a 401k and all these other things. And so the first 401k retirement accounts you actually see, and is still true of most employer accounts today, you have a choice of maybe 12 or 14 different investment options, and they all are what are called mutual funds. Mutual fund is essentially just you pour money, a bunch of people pour money to an account, and there's an account manager who makes decisions on how that account is going to invest its money based on a particular philosophy. Now, those mutual funds would charge a significant percentage of assets every year, a tax on whatever it is that you put in. So regardless of the performance of the mutual fund, that 2, 3, 4% sometimes that these guys were charging on these massive mutual funds that people were using to retire as a retirement fund, they'd skim off the top every year. So even if they didn't return that money, they still got paid. Okay, so they don't really have a shareholder incentive. I mean, eventually people will take their money out of an account that's underperforming and move it to somewhere else. So there was a competition there, but a hedge fund manager definitely would get paid regardless of how well he did, okay? And not only that, these guys aren't always aligned with actual shareholder interests, okay? They are friends with banks. They want to see the money come pouring in, okay? They don't necessarily care about how the company is doing individually, about the various companies they invest in, if they have competing interests in mind, right? They're not losing any money, you are. Well, in the wake of that and how expensive it was, the company Vanguard fought, and his name was Jack Bogle, I think, was the guy who did that. And he was like, we're going to use an index fund. It's going to be a no-brainer. There's going to be an actuary who figures out what the balance of stocks in the S&P 500 is, and we're going to reallocate every day how much we have invested in stocks to match the S&P 500. And we're going to do that with the Dow Jones Industrial and a bunch of others, right? And we'll charge you a lot less. And then you can track the market and you don't have to worry about the decisions that are being made. And Vanguard took off to become one of the biggest mutual fund. In fact, I think they are the biggest retail investment firm right now in the United States, Fidelity being number 2. But regardless of all that, our retirement stopped being a surety from a company where you're supposed to be putting the money away and instead started to get invested in the stock market, okay? And the speculation in the stock market, especially since the 1990s, has gotten crazy. If you ever look at the chart of the S&P 500 since the 1990s, it becomes much more jagged like this as time goes by. And that's because there's speculation. But the thing is you and I, if you have a standard, Vanguard retirement account and your employer, and you put 5% or 10% or whatever of your income into that every couple of weeks, the banks have a sure source of funding every single month. There is a constant supply of money coming in from workers who are looking to retire with that money. But the people on Wall Street don't look at it as your retirement money. You're buying something now for the hope that it's going to be worth more tomorrow. They're selling you something now thinking it's not going to be worth something tomorrow, or at least they have better opportunities, okay? Always remember, with every transaction, there's a buyer and a seller. Now, a lot of times that's mutually beneficial. I don't think that's true in investing. Someone is always selling something for some reason, okay? Now, maybe profit taking and maybe whatever. They do not see the opportunity that you do is what happens when you're a buyer and they're a seller, and vice versa, right? Another part of this is that pension funds for things like teachers and firefighters and stuff like that are administered by government. And the people running those institutions are often quite assailable in terms of bribery. Okay, and it happens very frequently. You'll read about like the Michigan Firefighters Fund or whatever that gets fleeced by some fly-by-night investor who managed to schmooze the account manager for that pension fund worth billions of dollars. That person's getting paid maybe $100K, if that, to manage that for the government. They get schnookered by some freewheeler dumping some bag on them, and they run all the way to the bank laughing, while that pension is now upside down, and all those firefighters and stuff don't have a retirement fund anymore. That happens frequently too. And it continues to happen because we allow that kind of speculation to happen in the market, right? Now, that's okay to speculate. That's part of it. But the idea that you're actually risking that money becomes less and less coupled to the actual person making the investment. I'll give an example of that. Okay, in 2009, you could get a $500,000 loan with your $50,000 a year income at 7% interest, because you're only paying the interest, and you managed to meet the mark to say that you qualify for this loan. And those loan brokers would do everything they could to get you to get that money so that they could get their commission. So that broker already has no incentive, long-term incentive in the health of the loan. All he's interested in is selling that loan because he gets to get a paycheck at the end of the week because he closed that loan, okay? Second is that the bank he's writing it for, their immediate thought is not to hold on to that loan for 30 years or whatever. Their thought is to pass that off into an investment firm that's buying these loans that have already been figured out and packaged and putting them in bonds and stuff like that. And they structured those bonds to make them look like they're lower risk than they are. So one hand after another takes those loans that are not in good shape and makes them look better because they themselves have no interest in the long-term health of that loan. If it defaults, it's someone else's problem. And that's really what happened in 2009. The big hit that happened was AIG. AIG was a 120-year-old insurance firm. They would, back the plays of shipping and, all sorts of stuff. They're a huge institution, and housing only made up like 5% or something like that, housing loans. But the idea behind AIG was, okay, it's insurance is basically, it's a reinsurance. So if I insure 100,000 homes against floods, okay, let's just say, and I use my actuarial tables and come up with a fair price or whatever based on risk assessment and damage and all that other stuff. I do all my BI. But then a typhoon comes through and wipes out all 100,000 houses, right? I, as an insurance fund, probably don't have that much money. But what I do is I also buy insurance for my insurance product from another larger firm that they also look at it. They look at the health of my company and they say, okay, well, the likelihood of that going belly up and we having to contribute money into that is a certain percentage. We charge you a certain percentage, right? And the idea there is that there's still a cushion, that there's a backstop that even if the insurance company doesn't have the liquidity to pay out in some abnormal event, that the reinsurance company would be able to handle that because of their own actual tables. But because they weren't actually assessing the risk properly, AIG ended up losing all of its value, not just their house coverage or home loan coverage department, but the entire firm did not have enough money to cover what happened in 2009, because all those loans suddenly went belly up all at once, and those insurance firms that had insured those bonds, they went belly up too. And now they came looking to AIG, and AIG didn't have enough money either. Okay, that was why things started to fall apart, is because after AIG there was nothing left, and so all those people started to lose money. And nothing government loves more than to help big bankers not lose money. We can't have bankers lose money. That whole adage about, your investment, your risk is up to the amount of money that you invest, that's for the little people. We don't let those banks go under. Sorry, you can tell I'm real salty about how they operate. Same thing was happening during 2009. The big banks were getting help from the government so they could charge less interest than the smaller banks could. And you can tell where that went. Now we have fewer banks. We have way fewer small banks. When I was a kid, there was way, way, way more different banks out there. Now it's a handful and credit unions. So we're in a situation now where we've become addicted to cheap money. Every time they crank up the interest rate 0.25%, we're at 3.5%, nowhere near what Paul Volcker was charging. And it's causing housing prices to struggle because housing prices are a function of interest. If your loan payment is now twice as much because the interest rates went up a point or two, you're not going to buy that house because you can't afford it. It has a pronounced effect on housing prices, because if you can't afford that mortgage, the mortgage payment is ultimately what it is that you're buying, right? Now, some people have capital and can buy the house for cheaper, and they're gonna have a lower, or not cheaper, but for a lower percentage of it as be their mortgage, or they can pay cash or whatever. But if you're trying to get a mortgage, you're not going to do it on $1 million at 6.5% unless you're making well over $100,000 a year, well over. Okay. So why is the price of housing still up? Well, people are using them as investment vehicles. In 2009, 2010, one of the big ones was China. I lived in a neighborhood where a third of the housing was owned by Chinese investors. They didn't even live in those houses. They maintained them, but the neighborhood was like a ghost town for a while. It was really weird and annoying. The price of housing was going up, which is good for me, but that's not what housing is for. People are supposed to be living here, right? Well, now we've made it so that BlackRock does it. They turn around and rent these houses out. You got some giant corporate landlord for individual houses that may or may not be in good shape, and they just charge whatever they want because the price of housing goes up, right? They have decreased the supply and use them as investment vehicles rather than the homes that they're supposed to be. I think it's fair to charge a fair price for a home and a piece of land, but $1 million for a 2,000 square foot home in Topeka, Kansas, or whatever, not reasonable for the average person. But people want houses. They have families. They have they have desires to advance themselves, and their incomes aren't cutting it, and the cost of everything keeps going up. And the most recent one, this was a real surprise, is why is inflation so crazy? Well, we did print half the money in existence in the last few years. It took a little while for that money to trickle into the system, but it's here now, and that's why the cost of everything is double. Because it's not really the cost of everything is double, it's the value of the dollar has gone to half. And it keeps going down. It's baked into the cake, by the way. They want it to inflate because they don't want you to hoard it. They don't want you to save it. They like it when interest rates are low because then they can lend the money out and keep it moving, right? And that old adage from the old Scrooge McDuck cartoon, money needs to keep moving. You can't, don't put it in a piggy bank is kind of his angle in that cartoon. This is true. It's called the velocity of money. But doesn't work if you don't have any, So what are people doing now? Okay. Well, they're speculating on things like Wendy's now. Just, hey, if everybody piles in and reduces the supply, it increases the demand. And if I can, stay on this gravy train long enough and get out before the music ends, I'll make a bunch of money. And it does happen. People do it. Okay? But because your income is not matching the level of the rising cost of everything, people are starting to get desperate and they're starting to gamble. And what's happening in the stock market right now, especially COVID was a big one, is people are speculating in the stock market in ways that they haven't done before. And what's government doing and banks doing to rein that in? They're lowering the requirements. The most recent one they got rid of was the pattern day trader restriction. So pattern day trading is when you buy and sell the same stock in the same day. They don't want you to do it because what that usually means is you're watching the charts and you're, okay, the trend line says it's going up. So I'm going to buy now and then sell in a few hours when it crosses a certain line, right? And for most people, that's not a good way to make money. I don't think it's a good way to make money for anybody, really, is to day trade, unless you happen to have insider information, you're gambling, right? You end up holding bags or whatever. But they got so in order to be able to do that with any level of regularity, and part of it has to do with the money that's available, right? So the idea is you can actually essentially spend more cash than you have in your account, and while everything settles out after a couple of days, there's a lot of movement that the bank has to do to accommodate for that, is part of that. And so they want you to have a certain amount of assets in there to essentially back that play so that they aren't on the hook to come up with the money on the back end to figure out your $3 that you made on your day trading operation, right? That's part of it. But the other part of that is they did that so that they don't want you doing that unless you have a certain amount of money. They consider you a sophisticated investor when you have a certain amount of money. That's the only metric, really. It doesn't mean you're a sophisticated investor, but they set an arbitrary amount and said, you got to have $25,000 in here to day trade. That's all there is to it. And most people can't come up with that to play with anyway. And so that barrier of entry helps reduce the noise. They got rid of that just recently. Why is that? Demand. They have, when I first started looking into stock options, and I have purchased stock options and I've had some luck and not some great luck on some of them, I've actually made a profit, believe it or not in buying options, but in selling them. That's where the money is. Writing the insurance policy, though you're exposing yourself to some risk there. And I haven't made a lot. I'll be very clear on that. It's risky business and it's stressful. And but the idea of a stock option is it gives you the right over a certain amount of time to buy a stock at a certain price or to sell a stock at a certain price. And the contract itself is worth money, depending on how much that stock is valued and how much time is left on the contract. It's a function of volatility, meaning how much the stock oscillates, time, meaning how long that contract lasts, and the strike price, whatever the price of the stock is currently. Obviously, if it's there's a $10 stock and you buy an option for it to be $20 tomorrow, that's going to be a cheap option because the likelihood is very low. But in any case, you can use stock options to gamble. The purpose of a stock option, let me back up a second. The purpose of a stock option originally was to help insure your position. Okay, so there are two basic types of options, and there are a number of strategies you can execute with them. But a call is the right to purchase a stock at a certain price before a certain time. And a put is the right to sell a stock at a certain price at a certain time. Now, you do not need to own the stock, but a lot of times what you would do is if you could sell a call, if you happen to own the stock, take the premium from selling that contract And if the contract expires and the stock hasn't gone up that amount, then you keep the stock and you keep the cash that you got from selling that contract. If the stock goes past the price, however, that gives the right to that person to buy that stock from you at that price of the stock thing. So at the strike price. So if the stock shoots you sell it for $50, a strike price of $50, and the stock goes to $100, you're out that money. Right? That was your risk, is that you got that little bit of premium and that person gets a big reward. And flip side, if I own a stock and I'm worried that it's going to go down, I can purchase a put, meaning that I have the right to sell this stock at a certain price. So if the stock is $50, I really don't want to keep it if it goes below 40. And if it goes really low, if I really don't want to hold that bag. So if I own a put, and I own the shares of the stock, I can sell that stock at that price to prevent losing any more money. Okay, but you can also just buy those contracts by themselves if you believe a stock is going to go up or a stock is going to go down. Now, obviously, you need the cash to buy the stock and you need the stock to sell the stock, but the bank will often. Most banks will back your play if you want to execute that trade and just take the spread difference. If you just want to cash it in, most of the contracts, first of all, you can just sell and trade on the open market. There's no actual execution that happens. But if you want to execute, then this can happen. You have a call option that you've got that's in the money, and you're like, I want to take profit on this, but you don't have enough money to buy the stock. You can still ask your broker, hey, I want to execute this trade. I want to buy the stock. It's at the strike price. I want to sell it on the open market immediately and take the difference. The bank will back you and facilitate that trade, which is kind of cool when you think about that. But it allows for gambling, right? You're betting on the ponies. Oh, is Apple going to go up by $10 before the end of the week? I'll buy this contract, and if it hits, I get a lot of money. But if it loses, I don't get much. And Wall Street Bets is kind of predicated on that idea that you're treating it like a casino. That it is unapologetic about that. Okay, and that's fun and funny, and you'd see some wild stuff on there. But it's no way to run your rodeo. I will say that much. It's one thing if you're wealthy and bored, but if you're trying to use this to make ends meet, it's not going to probably turn out well for you. And we saw during the GameStop scenario, there was a huge move of retail investors moving into this particular play because they heard about the rumors of it, and it did almost break the system. You do some research into what happened. There were all sorts of things happening on the back end to stop that stock from going up in value because they got caught in a loop where there was essentially too many shares of that stock in the system compared to what actually should have existed. And people picked up on that, and then they started buying the stock and hoarding it. And the banks did everything they could to prevent that stock from going parabolic. That's called a short squeeze, by the way. What happens is there are too many shares. In that case, there were too many shares of stock in the open market than actually existed. And so when people started buying it and hoarding it, the demand exceeded the supply dramatically. And this has happened with a couple of different stocks throughout history, that all of a sudden this $3, $5, $10, $20 stock goes up to $500 or something before the banks are like, oh, we're gonna lose the whole country over this. We gotta stop it, because they're playing shenanigans with the finances. And this is the issue, okay? The first stock that was ever issued was the Dutch East India Company, and it paid a 70% dividend, 70% dividend. What it was the idea that I want to participate in this shipping company, okay, this shipping organization, which is a very risky venture, but it has a lot of reward associated with it. And one of the ways you can distribute risk with shipping is you have multiple ships. If I have everything, all of my investment is in this one ship, and it's going to go to Argentina, and it's going to trade, cowrie shells for sugar, and then sugar for silver, and then bring that silver back to me. If that all goes well, I'm going to make a lot of money. But if my ship doesn't come in, that's where that term comes from. I'm waiting for my ship to come in. If the ship doesn't come in, it gets lost at sea, or something goes wrong, you're out everything, right? That's a huge risk. Well, you can distribute that risk by owning 100 ships. That way, when 1 or 2 of them, or even 10 of them go down, you can still make a profit by having a whole bunch of them, right? Well, of course, one person, generally speaking, doesn't own 100 ships, but you can go in with others to buy 100 ships. But the thing is you and I, in order to buy 100 ships, we all have to have 100 ships worth of money, okay? And in order to get more money to buy more ships, we're going to have to go find other investors. We're going to have to go drum up other people that want to join our partnership. And extracting yourself from that relationship can also be difficult too. So if I'm in a company with 100 ships, and me and Joe and Frank, we are all doing a good job and enjoying ourselves, well, Frank gets old. Frank wants to retire. He's done with this. Or Frank dies, right? What happens now? Well, his son, who's kind of a klutz, is now in charge. I don't want to rely on his ass. He doesn't make good decisions. Now the company is having trouble because the one of the founding members has died and been replaced with this other person that we didn't necessarily want in here, okay? So that what they were able to do was they said, okay, well, we're going to have the company, we're going to have the investors, and then we're going to have a board. We're going to actually have a group of people that we appoint, we all vote, and we appoint to who's in actual charge of this company, because I don't want to run the business in the first place. I've got, grapes to have dropped in my mouth because I'm filthy rich or whatever. But also, too, I want somebody who's skilled, and delegate that stuff, and we pay him or whatever. We all agree to pay him a certain amount or whatever to run the show. And the second part is the transferability. So I want out of my investment, okay? I need that money for something else. Well, again, extricating yourself from that situation, you're gonna have to find someone else to buy you out. And if the money is not there or whatever, you're just kind of stuck there, okay? It makes things very hard to transfer. And of course, me and Frank and Joe, we all created this company. Now we're gonna have to rewrite the charter to scratch my name out and put someone else's name in there or whatever, anytime an investor gets added. So what they did was they obfuscated the ownership of the company through stock ownership. They said, all right, we're going to cut the company up into 1,000 shares or whatever it is. And each of us gets a proportion of those shares based on how much we invested. And now whoever bears this stock certificate is the person who has that many votes in the operation of the company. So now I can sell in part or in whole any number of those shares to anyone else that wants to invest, and they can vote how they like. And I can get out for whatever the market will bear for my stock share, and other people can get in if they want to. And of course, the company can also issue more shares. They can say, you know what, we're going to carve the company up into smaller chunks so that we can raise some more capital so we can buy more ships. So in principle, again, we have 100 ships, 100 shares of stock. 1 share of stock, just for the sake of argument, represents a ship worth of the company, okay? We want to have 200 ships. We want to grow our operations. Well, we can cut another 100 shares of stock to buy more ship and sell them for the price of a ship. Now we have 100 ships in the company. Now you've been diluted. There's now 200 shares of stock. So the amount of power your vote has been cut in half, but the company itself is worth twice as much. So your original investment actually is the same or better than it was when that happened, because they were able to raise capital by issuing stock. All great ideas. The Dutch really had it figured out. Now, they had other stuff going wrong, namely their religious proclivities. Not a real fan of Calvinist Puritanism, but in terms of their economic sense, it obviously worked out for them. They were a free people, more or less, and a republic, and they were masters of finance in the 17th and early 18th centuries, okay? But that obfuscation is really what's at play. A company can own a company, can own a company, can own a company that's in a trust, that's in a, an LLC is in a whatever, right? And so you also are hiding the nature, the identity of the people who run the company, right? And mutual funds are piles of money that own a number of shares of companies, right? So the mutual fund itself is an entity. The guy who runs the mutual fund maybe cozy with the bank that he works for, or maybe he's cozy with some of the companies that are in the fund that he is working with, or enemies with them, whatever, right? But you end up removing the investor further and further and further and further away from the actual base of the operation. When you're the Dutch East India Company and you're paying a 70% dividend, which requires reinvestment if you want to continue owning that percentage of the company, but they issued the dividend. They said, here's the cash. Now, what do you want to do with it? Instead, they bloat the companies up. They don't release that cash to the investors. The investors are 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 steps removed, however many steps removed from the actual operation of the company. And nowadays, a lot of the boards of the companies, they don't get compensated in stock at all. They get immediate cash or immediate stock grants that in a lot of times run contradictory to the interests of the shareholders. And the people who are voting those people in are often hedge fund managers or mutual fund managers that may or may not be voting in your interests either. They may have another incentive in mind than seeing your value go up, because again, they collect their fee no matter what. So when you invest in your 401k, in your mutual fund that is a growth fund, you are putting money into the hands of a person or people who are making decisions for you to buy the stocks of companies where there are other people making decisions for you. And that's how you end up with things like Enron and Washington Mutual, where the operation of the company and the short-term profit incentives of the people working the company and the people who are buying that stock for their own banking interests runs contradictory to the actual interests of the shareholder. Toys R Us was doing all right until Bain Capital came along. Now, Bain Capital short sold the stock of Toys R Us to drive down their price, and they paid media to talk trash about the company in the wake of, Amazon and everything else, which were, I would say, fair, but they were lambasting it all over the news, how bad Toys R Us was, right? Toys R Us was, I don't think they were a Fortune 500. I think they were in the S&P. I don't know if they were the Dow, but they were a big company. And it started to hurt their stock performance, right? Well, Bain Capital did so much of this. They also naked short sold the stock, which means that they sold more shares of stock than actually existed to drive the price down. And there was a purpose to this, because what happened is it hurt the creditworthiness of the company. They started their market capitalization, because the actual value of their stock as available on the market continued to decline. They were having a hard time securing loans. Well, Bain Capital and their buddies was like, hey, we'll give you a loan to refinance your maturing balloon loans, but you got to put a couple members of ours on the board. And as soon as they do that, they start acting against the interests of the company. One of the things they did was made that company take a bunch of loans that they then turned around and gave to Bain Capital and their friends. They just gave that cash to them. They didn't invest it at all. They didn't refinance anything. They just took on more debt against the interests of shareholders and against the interests of the company, because they were acting on the behalf of this equity firm. So eventually the company got to a point where all it could do was service its loans, just the interest alone. It couldn't do anything else. And it eventually went under. Well, the people that owned that stock, the actual owners of the stock, were people who had that money in mutual funds, retirement funds. But they had them usually in index funds. Toys R Us only made up a small portion. So everybody took a haircut from the death of Toys R Us, but nobody really went under unless they were all in on Toys R Us for some reason. But the company went completely belly up because it got husked out by a company that was acting against its own interests. The board was acting against the interests, and the funds that actually gave that company money to do that were acting against their own interests because they were shorting the stock. And the beauty of that particular ugly design is that when you sell a stock short, you owe that stock back to somebody, and that stock gets delisted, you never have to pay the stock back. Even if there's only 100 shares of stock in existence and you owe 10,000 of them, you don't have to pay it back because the stock doesn't exist anymore. It went bankrupt. And you don't even have to pay tax on it because you never realize those gains because you can't close the sale of that stock. That is capitalism right now in America. So when you put your money in a savings account and you see a 4 cents return on your investment per month, the reason why is because the banks don't actually want your money. They don't actually want it. It's a pain in their ass to take your retail money. That's why they charge you, the merchants' transaction fees. That's where they make their money. They charge you interest off of your credit cards. If you carry a balance, that's where they make a lot of money. They charge you overdraft fees for buying a cup of coffee when you forgot that you drained your bank account because everything's so expensive. Charge you $20, $30 for that particular transaction. They make billions at it every year. So where do I put my money? Well, I have to invest it in something. Well, if inflation is 3, 4, 5%, and it's much higher, let's be real. Savings account doesn't offer me 6% so that I can at least not lose buying power to inflation. Where do I put it? I'll have to speculate. And the speculation is out of control. And just like 2009, this AI thing, it's going to go under. I don't know how ugly or clean that's going to be, but they're not going to make money on how much, they're not going to see a return on how much money is being spent on this particular endeavor. Not for a long time. And that's eventually going to wake up, and then you and I are all going to suffer. And if a bank has a hard time because of how much that they overstretch themselves, or some brokerage firm or whatever, they're going to get bailed out by the government. They're too big to fail. You losing your job, not an issue. But what that means to the average young person, young investor, is you got to let go of all that stuff that you've been taught. Okay? The little, put the money in the savings account and see it grow like a little seed. It doesn't work anymore, obviously. Now, if I had, $10 million, I might be able to invest in United States treasuries and see enough money out of that to feel comfortable from that living, 3.5% or whatever I can get out of treasuries right now. Even then, the value, the principal value of that could go down because as treasuries go up in interest rates, because the creditworthiness of the country goes up, the amount of value of your stock, of your bond holdings goes down. It's inversely related. So even then, I make $350,000 off of my $10 million investment, but now it's worth $8 because the interest rates on bonds is now much higher. That's what we're dealing with because our interest rates were so low for so long. It was unnatural. And now we're dealing with the aftermath of it. Nobody wants their housing prices to go down because their net worth is tied into it. So they do everything they can to keep those housing prices shored up. We don't care if foreign investors buy up 3/4 of the homes and BlackRock buys the rest. As long as my house is worth something, that's great. Keep that demand shored up or we'll kill you. It's kind of how the boomers think. And it's boxing normal people out of what should not be considered an investment asset of that nature. It's not to say that a house isn't an investment, but a house should not be treated as a speculative investment. But it's hard not to. I bought a house in 2018 that I sold in 2024, 6 years later, for twice what its value was. It doubled in value over the course of 6 years. That is not healthy. It's not healthy. Not in the interest rate environment that we're in. If you can double your money in a savings account if you have compound interest of 7% every year, okay, or in a stock. The stock market is the one that's closest to that, the broad stock market. But even then, that's a risky investment because any given year you can go and look and see that half of your money is gone. And that is baked into the cake, I believe, too. There's a regular fleecing that's happening in the stock market because workers keep investing in it. And that's part of the reason why I don't invest in the stock market anymore. I don't put my money there because I don't understand what's going on. I have no idea what shenaniganry is going to cause the value to go down again. You know, at least with real estate, which I hate real estate too, because you got to rent it out and all that other stuff, you know, if you're going to invest in that. But at least with real estate, you get a loan, you know what the numbers are. Same with a bond. You know, you buy a bond, you know what the numbers are with the risk of default, I guess is the big risk there. But people are speculating in order to try to make ends meet or try to get ahead. And that is why you see things like the value of Wendy's shoot up 30% over one night. It's not because of their business model. It's not because of some great news. It's because people are getting viral and using the internet to their advantage to try to increase the value of their own holdings. The pump and dump scheme has gotten far more elaborate in the 21st century. So caveat emptor, as always, understand what it is that you're buying when you invest, and don't gamble unless you can afford to lose it. You know, I go to the casino, that money is gone in my mind. I have a great time in the casino, I lose money. I hear about people who strike it rich in the casino. Never happens to me, never will, I don't think. That's okay. That's not why I'm there. I'm there to have fun. I'm not in the stock market to have fun. I would be there to make money. But because I don't know any given day what's going to happen to my investment, I'm not going to do it. That's how I feel about it. And I just don't know what the alternative is. And that's really the risk that everybody has. But we're all in that boat. And that is why you see things like what's happening with SpaceX. That IPO was massive. And they made a lot of money up until they offered options to retail. And then suddenly the stock started to not do so well. I'm sure a lot of money changed hands from retail to banker when the stock options started to get written on that stock the third day after it was traded. So when you look around a room and you don't know who the mark is you.